try and take a more serious approach and move on to Dr. Shaun Evans from Bangor. Shaun is going to start out by saying a few words about the research centre on Welsh estates that he leads in Bangor. But I can, before he does that, I can welcome him to these seminars, and I can say that he is talking about a phenomenon which is by no means Welsh, but is common right across the British Isles in the 19th and early 20th century, and that is the coming of age celebration. So I'm particularly pleased that we have a paper which is looking at a form of activity which is commonly encountered but has never really received the attention that it deserves. And I'm very pleased that Shaun is beginning to give us some work on this and beginning to explore what these celebrations, what these festivities mean, both for the landowners and for the people who take part in them as tenants and as often shopkeepers in the towns and villages that the landowners own. So in no more ado, can we welcome Shaun Evans? And Shaun, you're going to say a few words about the Welsh Centre to begin.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation. I'll just share my screen. As Richard says, I'm going to be talking about coming of age celebrations in Wales from the late 18th century through to the early 20th century. So through to that period really when estates and country houses were starting to be broken up and sold in Wales, and with the demise of landed estates in Welsh society, you get the demise of the celebration of the festivities and activities associated with the attainment of the majority of the heir to that holding. As Richard said, I'm responsible for the Institute for the Study of Welsh Estates at Bangor University, which is a research centre that has been set up to analyse the influence and the role and the function of landed estates and country houses in Wales in relation to the histories and cultures and landscapes in Wales. So we've got a package of projects under the umbrella of the Institute currently underway, mostly doctoral projects. We've got 8 doctoral projects on the go at the moment. Most of them are regional or estate-specific case studies and ranging chronologically from the 16th and 17th centuries through to the late 19th centuries at the moment. At Bangor, we operate as a collaboration with the university archives and special collections, because from the 1930s, especially, the then university librarian Thomas Richards went around the country houses of North Wales, knocking on the door and asking, can we have your archives? And as a result, managed to acquire for the university a fantastic collection of estate records, which provide a fantastic insight into the social and the cultural, the rural and other histories of Wales. So very much collections-based research, largely collaborative, interdisciplinary too, significant public profile and events program. So if you want to find out about some of our activities, do visit our website. In addition to our doctoral research projects, we've also recently started an AHRC funded project, a deep mapping project. So it's a GIS initiative which aims to track the development and evolution of estate landscapes in a particular area in northeast Wales from 1500 through to the early 20th century. So if you want to find out more about that initiative, you can ask me at the end, or again, look at our website. So from a personal research perspective, really interested in Welsh gentry culture, the operation of landed estates, the relationship between landowners and tenants, with those, I suppose, those cultural and linguistic dimensions that we've been discussing in relation to John's talk earlier on. And one of my real fascinations over the past few years really has been the coming of age celebration. So when I was doing my doctoral research, I'd quite regularly give talks to local groups and societies, history groups, and WI groups and so forth. And at the end of my talks on the Mostyn family and estate and its local historical significance, members of the audience would quite often come up to me and show me the mug that their parents or grandparents had received either in 1877 or 1906 on the coming of age of the Mostyns during that period. And I became really interested in these mugs initially, and the events which they commemorated, and then I suppose the legacy and the memory of coming of age celebrations initially on the Mostyn estate, and then across estates throughout Wales. I began to find more and more references to these celebrations. So the tree that's pictured on the slide was located just up the road from where I was born and grew up, in Tremoston in Flintshire. Had to be cut down a few years ago because it was rotten, but it was planted at a prominent junction of various roads within the Whitford parish as part of the celebrations of the future Lord Mostyn in 1877. So when I've been visiting country houses and archives as part of the work of the Institute over recent years, I've kept my eye out for references to these celebrations, and there's quite a lot of visual and material culture in Welsh country houses relating to these celebrations, especially the illuminated or illustrated addresses which were presented to the heir on the occasion, which are often still displayed and framed in the country house setting, and also the gifts that they received on the occasion, which often have inscriptions and are often held as heirloom items. In estate archives as well, there's a diversity of records relating to these events on their organisation, the expenditure involved, the different activities, and also invitations to guests and so forth as well. And these events were covered prolifically in the local press throughout the 19th century. So there's a significant record and memory, and I suppose legacy of these occasions. But right across the British and Irish Isles, there's been very little academic analysis on what these celebrations meant, what their purpose was, what their significance was. So that's what I'm planning to explore in this presentation, and hopefully in a forthcoming book too. John's talk that he's given earlier this afternoon provides a really good context for this analysis. Really, he's pointed to many of these sort of the backdrop for these coming of age celebrations across the long 19th century, if you like. So these orientate around the emergence and the powerful narrative which was created by radical nonconformist movement in Wales across the 19th century, which was based on separating and segregating all communities in Wales, so every village and every valley into two parts. The one landowning, Anglican, English-speaking, Tory; the other non-conformist, Welsh-speaking, politically liberal. And this attempt to divide Wales into two parts was at the heart of the radical nonconformist movement for the reinvention of Wales across the late 19th century. The political goals of which rested on disestablishment of the Anglican Church in Wales and disintegration of the landed estate, and especially the political influence that land ownership afforded to the owners of these estates too. So initially very much about taking political control away from the owners of landed estates in Wales. As I've said, this involved the creation of a picture of division and conflict in every community in Wales between what became known as the Gwerin, or the common people of Wales, if you like, the true custodians of Welsh consciousness on the one part, and landowners on the other. So it was a narrative that sort of looked beyond the evident difference in wealth and class, to really divide these two parts of Welsh society based on religious and political, cultural and linguistic identity. And as John has mentioned, towards the end of the 19th century, these issues come together really in the Welsh land question. So especially during the period of agricultural depression from the late 1870s, John's mentioned the Tithe War, the so-called Tithe War in northeast Wales, which sort of played into and combined these the disestablishment question with issues of land. And then you have prominent radical liberal politicians using Gladstone's Liberal Party as their parliamentary vehicle for achieving their objectives. Individuals like Tom Ellis, who's pictured here, to argue for fundamental reform of the way in which estates and land operate in Wales too, which leads to the appointment of a Royal Commission on Land in the 1890s, this massive exploration of Welsh society based on the function of the landed estate and the operation of landowner-tenant relations too. Within the next decade, these estates, which had been a really prominent fundamental feature in Welsh society for centuries, they begin to break up with initially with the sale of outlying areas, and then increasingly the breakup and diminishment of country houses and estates too. And then what you see in across the 20th century is that radical nonconformist narrative, which is built up and developed across the 19th century. It becomes really integrated into how Welsh history, how Welsh social and cultural history is presented by the new academic institutions, which are partially created out of the success of radical nonconformity. So the new Welsh cultural institutions and universities, which are established across the 20th century, which very much adopt this narrative of an anglicised and alienated gentry landowning class in opposition to the Gwerin, the true custodians of Welsh consciousness. Summarised here by Henry Richard, one of the most prominent radical members of Parliament for Merthyr, I think. The people who speak this language, who read this literature, who own this history, who inherit these traditions, who venerate these marvellous religious organisations, the chapels, the people forming 3/4 of the people of Wales, have they not a right to say to this small propertied class, we are the Welsh people and not you. This country is ours, not yours, and therefore we claim to have our principles represented in the House of Commons. The medal here is the commemorative medal, which was produced for Love Jones Parry, the successful Liberal candidate in the 1868 election, where he defeats the heir to the Penrhyn estate, and it's Trech Glad Nag Agloyd, means the land is stronger than its lord, which sort of gets to the heart of some of this messaging. What's really interesting though is you have celebrations such as the coming of age celebrations, which are a really prominent feature in Wales across the long 19th century, which paint a very different picture of Welsh society and landowner-tenant relations, and indeed the identities of Welsh landowners and their estates across this period. So what I'm interested in exploring in my research into coming of age celebrations is how they can be used to provide a route into exploring these relationships, I guess, in a more nuanced manner. As Richard said in his introduction, these celebrations are a feature across British and Irish Isles. They seem to become more prominent from the late 18th century as sort of big public celebrations, though previously the 21st birthday, the attainment of majority status, had been important as a life cycle and a legal significance. But you get hundreds of these celebrations in Wales across the late 18th to the early 20th century. And in Wales, the coming of age celebration for Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne, the 4th Baronet, seems to have provided the impetus and I guess the template for the celebrations in Wales which followed. These celebrations occurred on the large estates, such as Cawdor, and Mostyn and Winstay and Penryn and Vaynol and Nanai, for example, but also on the smaller estates too. The larger ones tended to involve multiple events and celebrations, sometimes extending over a couple of weeks and across various geographical locations where the estate had influence. For smaller estates, for the heirs of smaller estates, they tended to be a single day's activity, but still recognised as an important event for the locality, often involving thousands of participants. What they do is they really stress the involvement of all parts of society, and they make a real effort to try and include the poorest through to obviously the focus of the celebrations, the future local landowner. And I think they're interesting as a focus for historical analysis, because they put landowning families in face-to-face positions with the communities over whom they seek to exercise power and authority, and they make them interact. And it's that interaction between landowning families, between the gentry, the squirearchy, the aristocracy, and their tenants, the people who work on the estate, and other people in the locality who have an interest in the estate, or the estate has an ability to influence their lives and livelihoods in some manner, which I think makes them interesting as a focus for analysis. They're overwhelmingly celebratory and positive in tone, these celebrations, and I'm interested in how do we bridge that gap between that narrative of tension and conflict on Welsh estates and this celebratory picture we get from the coming of age celebrations. How do these two interpretations fit together? How do we use coming of age celebrations as a prism for exploring that? What these celebrations tended to include was a range of events and activities. They're often presented as spontaneous local celebrations, but they're always preceded by careful planning and preparation by local committees, often working closely with the family at the heart of the celebration, usually through the land agent. So they're highly choreographed in terms of the timetable of events and activities that were to take place, and often involved vast expenditure too. The main day of celebration is often observed locally as a public holiday. So everything, the local sort of economy closes down for the day, and people, all parts of the community, encouraged to put on their best clothes and attend and have an enjoyable day as well. Some of the main activities include the ringing of church bells, the firing of cannon, the erection of triumphal arches, and bunting and flags and mottos in Welsh and English language, which is interesting too. The procession of an ox with gilded horns through the street, which would be roasted and butchered, divided up between members of the poor members of the community. The procession of the heir through the local village or town, usually to the accompaniment of a marching band, occasionally with local school children, sometimes carried aloft, and with occasionally with the local militia. And then they proceed to the main focus of the celebration, which is usually outside the place or the country house. So all members of the community would congregate outside the house. If it was a nice day, outside, very occasionally inside the house, but usually in specially erected marquees to host the celebrations. And then outside the hall, delegations of tenants or local shopkeepers, or the people who worked on the estate would present illuminated addresses to the heir. This was a physical item, usually highly decorated, symbols and emblems and so forth as well, but it was also read out aloud as well. This is the centerpiece of the celebration. The heir and his family member would often respond, and you get a series of these speeches by the eldest tenant on the estate, the land agent, other people with a vested interest in the future of the estate and what its future should hold, giving these addresses, these speeches throughout the day. Importantly, it's held as the first public appearance of the heir to the estate, usually a male, of course. Occasionally, you get heiresses inheriting, and they're really interested in their own right too. But it's very clearly an overwhelming moment for the heir, the focus of the celebration, the first time really he's been introduced to the community over which one day he hopes to preside. Those coming of age celebrations where the heir is actually taking up his position as landlord have sort of an added influence, an added emphasis on them as well. But this is all followed up by feasting, lots of drinking, especially of cwrw da, or some strong beer, which is occasionally brewed the year of the birth of the heir as well, and kept as well, so you can imagine. Country games, singing, Welsh music and poetry, dances, hilltop bonfires in the surrounding countryside, fireworks, so, you know, a real celebratory atmosphere. The purpose, of course, of these events is to celebrate inheritance, the prospect of the next generation of a landed family. So it's about dynastic succession, the preservation of landed power and influence, and with that, stability in society. These are occasions which stress links between the past, the present, and the future. Heritage and tradition have a hugely important role to play at these celebrations. And for families which have been established for a long time as well, ancestry, heraldic display, and indeed individual ancestors emerge as sort of key players in the celebration too. And what the celebrations tend to stress or try and create is this idea of a hereditary community, both of the landowning family and those other parts of community, especially the tenantry, which coexist on the estate as well, stressing the mutual shared interests between these different parts of society for the good of the locality going forward too. And what they emerge as, because of the opportunities they allow for interaction between these various groups, opportunity to re-embed and reset roles, to renegotiate roles and responsibilities on the landed estate into the next generation. What you get, of course, you've got this huge emphasis on stressing continuity of power and stability. But of course, all this is masking significant change across the long 19th century, including significant instability in the makeup of Welsh landed society itself, with the end of many long-established lineages, and including the introduction of new landed power and influences into Welsh society, especially from profits made in industry, especially coal mining, slate quarrying, for example, and those families who have recently inherited land through marriage, purchase, and so forth as well. So for both long-established families and new members of landed society, it provides an opportunity to reset relations with communities as well. And you often see reactions to these social and political and economic contexts of change and disruption being referred to as part of the addresses as well. So the political changes across the 19th century, increased industrialization. On the Vaynol estate, for example, just outside Carnarvonshire, the main celebration takes place within the Dinorwig quarry, where you've got thousands of quarrymen and their families singing Welsh hymns and welcoming the heir to the celebration, who he arrives on one of the quarrying trains, and the report says he's visible, he's physically hit by this song within the quarry too. So you get reflections on the non-conformist, the agricultural depression, agendas of agricultural improvement, and so forth, coming through as part of the speeches and so forth, which is very interesting. I think they're really useful for assessing the nature of the relationship between landowners and tenants, because through the addresses, it provides an opportunity for tenants, but also people working on the estate, other people in the community who have an interest in the estate succeeding, to set out roles and expectations and responsibilities in a way that will be beneficial to them. So you see in the wording of illuminated addresses and associated speeches too, the sort of the overarching message of congratulations and gratitude being loaded with essentially instructions and expectations in a very similar way, actually, to how medieval Welsh praise poetry worked, where you get an idealized framework of behavior being presented to the subject of the poem, just as here you have in the illuminated addresses, having an idealized, often highly ancestral model of landowner behavior being outlined in the address, almost saying this is how we expect you to behave as our landowner, and we'll recognize you as our landowner and show due deference, but only if you keep up your part of the bargain. These are also interesting because it was an event which demanded always a response from the heir and other members of his family as well. So the heir had to respond to the official address that was given to him. So he had to, or she had to respond to almost the demands, or certainly the model of behavior that was presented to him or her. And these could be generic, about, don't raise rents, invest in agriculture, or they could be more specific, relating to some of the themes that John's talked about in his talk earlier today as well. So what you get, I think, at these occasions, these really prominent, loaded celebrations, important life cycle occasion for the heir and the family too, is an opportunity to negotiate social roles in rural Wales, and I think that's really interesting in that respect. They also have a significant influence on the landscape. They temporarily transform the appearance and the acoustics of landscapes across Wales, these celebrations, with the erection of triumphal arches and bonfires and the firing of cannon and so forth as well. But they also leave lasting marks in the landscape too, with the commissioning of water fountains and clocks and gates, and indeed in some occasions churches as well, which are created, which are built as celebrations to commemorate these occasions. Perhaps the most famous being the town clock in the middle of Machynlleth, which was erected in 1873 to celebrate the coming of age of Lord Castlereagh. So you get some of these lasting markers in the landscape, but it's really interesting in how these celebrations move through the landscape. So you get to see the influence and the integration of a landed estate with other aspects of the landscape, whether that be the local pub, or the position of the chapels, the church halls, the medieval ruins, the quarries, and so forth. So they provide really interesting perspectives on the composition of the built environment. They're also really interesting because they allow public access to spaces which are habitually not publicly accessible. So in some occasions, you get very direct references to the gates of the park, to some of the country houses being physically taken off their hooks to allow public access to these spaces. So you get lots of commentary on what the country house was in terms of Welsh consciousness and Welsh landscape, and some of those descriptions are really interesting in terms of how we are to understand the position of the country house in relation to Welsh identity too. And then you also get individual landscape features such as really important trees, for example, which have important roles in terms of familial identities too. Finally, they provide a really useful lens for exploring how estates interacted with Welsh identity. The proceedings of these occasions, and especially the toasts that were given during the dinners and so forth, they very much emphasize that Welsh landed society was part of part of the British state, so showing affiliation to monarchy, church, empire, national politics. The local MPs are always represented, the local lieutenants of the county always represented, and so forth as well. But what's really interesting is how so many of these occasions develop and evolve into decidedly Welsh, distinctively Welsh affairs. So going back to some of those issues John mentioned in his talk as well, they provide really good evidence for the role and significance and operation of the Welsh language on estates. So especially those occasions where you have addresses given to landowners in the Welsh language, and some landowners being able to respond in Welsh, some landowners having to apologise for not being able to speak Welsh, and recognising that as an important part of their role as a landowner in Wales. But also then the performance of Welsh praise poetry and so forth in these occasions too. It provides a lens for exploring how the Welsh language, how bilingualism operated within Welsh-speaking communities, which I think is very interesting too. It also brings to the fore the various components and parts of Welsh identity. So we've talked about the linguistic elements. There's significant cultural element with some events such as the coming of age celebrations at Llanarth and Nanai and Nanteos and Mostyn, almost emerging as Welsh cultural festivals, very much celebrations of what Wales was, with Eisteddfodau often offering prizes for poems to be presented on these occasions too. Ancestral heritage also emerges as a key feature. So how some of these landowners still into the 19th century see their descent from the old princes of Wales as an important part of their legitimacy in 19th century Wales, or at least that's how they're presenting it within this public sphere. And then those other issues that John's mentioned as well, the playing out of religious identities. Often you have non-conformist ministers involved in the organising committees for coming of age celebrations, recognising that there needs to be some form of acknowledgement, but not happy at all that they'll be drinking a beer and celebrations up at the bonfire and so forth, wanting something of public use, for example. So you see those issues coming through, of course, and as well it adds complexity to the sort of the radical Tory division in Welsh society as well, where you've got very prominent coming of age celebrations celebrating long established liberal leaning landowners as well, which adds complexity to it. And indeed the appearance of radical politicians such as Tom Ellis, Michael D. Jones speaking as the main speakers on the Rwlas coming of age celebration. So you get an insight into all of these. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, I think the coming of age evidence does not support that simplistic narrative of deep-seated division in Welsh society between a homogenous Gwerin and a homogenous gentry or landowning class. It's much more nuanced. We see the landed estate as an integral part of people's lives and experiences in Wales, and the estate as something that's deeply embedded still in Welsh society, landscape, culture, heritage, and economy, notwithstanding the increasing role of the chapel in public life either. We see these celebrations being used by members of the community in an attempt to shape or negotiate social roles and relations too. And indeed, we see landowners recognising the fact that they're in Wales and that they need to make use of, or promote, or at least engage with Welshness in its various forms. And I very much hope that there'll be other studies of coming of age celebrations on individual states and in other regional and national contexts to compare and contrast the Welsh experience going forward. If you want to find out more about the work of the Institute, our website and Twitter feed and so forth there, be delighted to respond to any questions that you have. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.